And we're coming to you live from the Billy C Studios in Lake George, New York. I'm Bill Calogero, and it's time for the Talking Boxing with Billy C show. Don't even know the name of my show. Good day, good evening, good morning. Whether I'm in the right order or not, who cares? Glad you could be with us today or tonight or whatever. Today's show is being brought to us in part by the Title Bout Championship computer game. Get yourself a copy right now. Visit our website, www. You know what? You don't have to do the wwws no more. It's just BillyCBoxing.com. Click on the Title Bout banner. Now, remember, it's a simulation game, so you can put guys like our topic tonight, Joe Louis against Klitschko or whatever. It's a great game. Get yourself a copy. Make sure you tell them Billy C sent you. Today's show is also being brought to you in part by the Southern Gourmet Spice Company. Check out why Kenny Bear's barbecue rub, his seasoned salt, and my all-time newest favorite, the Cajun spice, is the only seasoning that I use on everything. Check it out, southerngourmetspice.com. That's southerngourmetspice.com. Make sure you tell them Billy C sent you and demand the Billy C discount. And finally, today's show is being brought to us in part by, you guessed it, my book, Tom Molino, From Bondage to Baddest Men on the Planet, is out right now, where all good books are sold. You can get a copy right now where you're watching or listening to this very show. Just visit barnesandnoble.com, or, of course, you can always go to amazon.com. Okay, here we go. Today's show, Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber. I got some great stuff. You know, Dax Khan is going to be joining us a little bit. Alex Papali is going to be joining us a little bit later. And we're going to give you our thoughts on former world heavyweight champion and boxing Hall of Famer Joe Louis. Let me start off by saying Joe Louis is a lot of people consider him one of the best heavyweights of all time. Right up there with generally when you're mentioning Joe Louis's name, you're also sprinkling in Rocky Marciano and Muhammad Ali. I mean, typically those are the three when you start going back in time. But Joe Louis is a little special, and I'll tell you why. This was a guy that fought, beginning in the 30s, just before the mid 30s, I would say. 1934 was his pro debut, and his last fight was his loss to Rocky Marciano in 1951, changing of the guard, so to speak. He had already lost his title and then climbed back up into ranks to get a shot at Rocky Marciano. But the story of Joe Louis goes a lot deeper, and I'm gonna tell you right now, I got something really cool that we're gonna be playing here a little bit later. A good friend of mine who is no longer with us, Steve Lott. I don't know how many of you know who Steve Lott was, but when Mike Tyson was in his prime, there were two guys, Jacobs and Bill Clayton, were the two guys that you always saw associated with Mike Tyson, of course, Customato. But the third guy of the Clayton Jacobs mix was Steve Lott. And Steve Lott had a lot to do with the organization called Big Fights Incorporated, which was the collection, the boxing collection of Jacobs and Clayton. And this was the same collection that ESPN bought for some outrageous amount of money. But Steve Lott maintained the rights to a lot of other video. As a matter of fact, he gave us the permission when we did our show with the late, great Sal, Rocky Santacola, and myself did our programs where we rebroadcast some of these great fights. They were given to me, and I got the permission to re-air them by Steve Lott. Now, Steve Lott also had given me a copy of the original radio broadcast of Joe Louis against Max Schmeling, the rematch, okay? And we first aired it with Steve Lott when I did an event in Las Vegas back in 2012, September 11th, 2012, to be exact. And we had a lot of fun there. We broadcast for a week from Las Vegas, had some great guests and stuff. You can punch it up and find it. But in any event, I have that, and I'm going to play that a little bit later. So that's coming up. And it's pretty much bone chilling when you listen to it, and I'll tell you why. You got a lot of people don't realize when Joe Louis fought Max Schmeling the first time and suffered his first defeat. Let's see, the date on that was June 19th, 1936. Now, going into that fight, Joe Louis was undefeated, and he was trying to get a title shot. And at the time, Max Schmeling was now remember, this is World War II, so you're dealing with Nazi Germany and all of this stuff. And Max Schmeling was an up and coming fighter, and actually Hitler wanted him to come over to the United States and beat the beloved Joe Louis, who incidentally, again, he wasn't the world champion yet. It's important I keep mentioning that, and you'll see why a little bit later. But he went into this fight. Max Schmeling was 48 wins, 7 losses, and 4 draws. The fight was at Yankee Stadium in the Bronx, and it was scheduled for 15 rounds. And Max Schmeling knocked out Joe Louis, knocked him out in this fight. And it was something that Joe Louis couldn't deal with it. And this is a shot right here of Joe Louis on the canvas being counted out. And Max Schmeling is in the background right there, okay? So this happened, like I said, in 1936. Now, give you a little history. Max Schmeling went on to win the title and then lose it. Mike, well, actually, I'm wrong. Max Schmeling had a title shot and lost. The title ended up in the hands of the Cinderella Man, Jim Braddock. And Joe Louis went and fought all these fighters, Jack Sharkey, Eddie Sims, young Stanley Ketchel, Bob Pastor, and he finally got his shot at Jim Braddock. Now, here's a shot of Braddock and Louis. But Louis couldn't get the Max Schmeling fight out of his head, okay? And they wanted to have a rematch. So we're going to get to that in a little bit about the rematch. And that, boys and girls, is the fight that we have on the radio, the rematch that we have the original radio broadcast, okay? But back to just looking at Joe Louis's career, he was undefeated going into that fight against Max Schmeling, got knocked out in the 12th round. The fight was scheduled for 15, got back in the ring 2 months later and had a win over Jack Sharkey. And like I said, his next fight was Al Editor and Jorge Briscada, Eddie Sims, young Stanley Ketchel, Bob Pastor, Nady Brown, which set up his world championship fight against Jim Braddock in 1937 in Chicago. The fight was scheduled for 15 rounds, and Joe Louis, knocked out Braddock in the 8th to win the world title. Now, this is where a lot of people, you'll hear the term bum of the month club. A lot of people were, critical of the fighters that Joe Louis was fighting. But as we talked about on this show, a lot of these guys would have been champions today with all the belts. And let's take a look at some of these fighters because Jim Braddock was a great fighter in his own right. But after that fight, so he won the title. And by the way, Max Schmeling won the title prior to this fight. Just to give you the history, I skipped over this. Max Schmeling had won the title in 1930 with a disqualification win over Jack Sharkey. He lost it in 1932 to Sharkey, which was a very controversial fight. So Max Schmeling himself, was also a former world champion when he fought Joe Louis. But anyway, after Joe Louis wins the title in 1937 against Jim Braddock, he faces some pretty tough opposition when you look at these guys. Tommy Farr, Nathan Mann, Harry Thomas, Max Schmeling, the fight we're going to talk about a little bit later, John Henry Lewis. He fought in 1939. And, the wins that he has, he ended up losing his world title he won his world title against Jim Braddock, and he fought all the way up until he lost to Ezra Charles, actually. And look at these wins. Bob Pastor, Arturo Goodeye, Johnny Paycheck was another good fighter of his time. Al McCoy, yeah, the real Al McCoy. Gus Duriazo, Abe Simon. Abe Simon was a fighter that, he was a big guy, and he was a talented fighter that, of the time, because of all the talent that was out there, didn't get the credit where he was due. He was another guy that Joe Louis knocked out in the 13th round of a, by the way, scheduled 20-round fight. He also has wins over Buddy Bear, Billy Conn in that famous fight where Billy Conn was having his way against Joe Louis and decided he wanted to go for the knockout. He was way ahead on scorecards, could have won the fight easy. The fight was scheduled for 15 rounds. It was a 13-round loss for Billy Conn because he went for the knockout, and you just don't do that against Joe Louis. Lou Nova, he fought Billy Conn again, Tammy Morallo, Jersey Joe Walcott, and then finally he fought Ezra Charles in 1950, after holding on to the title for 27 successful title defenses, where he won 22 of those by knockout and lost the title to Ezra Charles. He climbed up the ranks again after the Ezra Charles fight and fought a couple of quality opponents. Lee Savold, he fought Caesar Bryan, and Jimmy Bivens. A lot of you guys, hopefully, you know who Jimmy Bivens is, and beat him. And he earned the shot against Rocky Marciano and ultimately lost, and that was his last fight. Joe Louis had a career record of 66 wins, 52 coming by knockout, 3 losses, and 2 of those he was stopped. The Max Schmeling fight and, of course, the Rocky Marciano fight. The other loss that he had was his second fight against Ezra Charles. I believe he lost 2 fights to Ezra Charles. Max Schmeling, I'm sorry. Max Schmeling was the one, Ezra Charles, and, of course, Rocky Marciano. So, Joe Louis, some other things about Joe Louis. Joe Louis was a real likable guy. Everybody loved him. And Dax mentioned it last week about how following Jim Crow America and the way Jack Johnson was perceived as a black American heavyweight champion and how cocky he was and everything else, Joe Louis was kind of managed and coached on how to act so that everyone would love him. And it worked because everyone did love him, except for the government. And I'll tell you why. This is a part of Joe Louis's story that just irks me to this day. Joe Louis, first of all, Joe Louis should get credit. He World War II, he was in the Army. Now, during the time that Joe Louis was in the Army, it was segregated. Joe Louis made a big deal about it because Joe Louis would fight and donate his purses for the war effort. Here's a shot of Joe Louis in his uniform, and ultimately the government taxed him. He donated his whole purse to the war effort, right? And the government taxed him. No one advised him about that. And years later, they went after him for tax evasion until the day he died. They were hounding him, drove him crazy. I have a hard time ever forgiving our own government for doing what they did to Joe Louis. If it was something like some of these clowns today, don't pay the taxes or whatever, or fight just to pay the taxes on the previous fight, you could make the argument. But this was a man, Joe Louis, who fought for the war effort and donated his friggin' purse to the war effort, okay? And they still wanted to tax him on it. It kills me. It kills me. But the other thing that he should get credit for is that Joe Louis was instrumental in making the desegregating the service. He made a big thing about it, and he said, because here he was. Excuse me a minute. Here he was, fighting and donating his purse, and they weren't going to let the other black, soldiers sit in the same arena, and he was like, "What are you, crazy?" No, and he caused them to be able to sit with their fellow soldiers that were different color than them, and ultimately helped desegregate the United States military. But anyway, Joe Louis, devastating puncher. He was a guy that, even this guy, Muhammad Ali, loved Joe Louis. And here's a shot of Muhammad Ali with Joe Louis. And this fight was in 1975. Joe Louis was 61 years old at the time, and he looks pretty old. If you look at this shot again, I mean, everybody looked old in that time. I mean, they can't look as young and as cheerful as myself. But the truth of the matter is if you ever punch up, if you Google Joe Louis last photo with cowboy hat, if you do that, you'll see a shot of Joe Louis when he died. He was 66 years old. I'm telling you, he looked like he was 90. He was in a wheelchair and everything else. He was married a couple of times. He did have a problem with drug abuse towards the end of his life, which shocked me when I learned that years ago. Especially such a guy that was regarded as such a clean American, and to find out that he was actually addicted to heroin for a long time. Towards the end of his life. Joe Louis was a guy that was beloved by not just boxing fans, but by a lot of people, by everyone, actually. How could you not like Joe Louis? The Bum of the Month Club, I think, really puts in perspective of what the times were like compared to what they are today. Like I said, Abe Simon would have easily have been a champion today. And the list goes on and on with those bums of the month. He fought frequently, had all those title defenses. Another interesting thing to show the differences of the times, Joe Louis's average weight was around 200 pounds when he fought. He was 6'1" and a half inches tall. He had a 76-inch reach. The heaviest he fought at was 218 pounds. When he fought Rocky Marciano was 213 and 3/4 pounds. So what's amazing about Joe Louis is that he was so disciplined. And you could tell even aging, he maintained pretty close to his weight. Very by the book fighter. He set people up. He had devastating punching power. He just was a great fighter. I mean, there'll never be another Joe Louis. And when I say that, I'm not saying that there may not be a guy that you could make an argument about. So-and-so was better, he had a better record, or whatever the case is. But the difference is that Joe Louis, he was, the whole country loved Joe Louis, and beyond the country loved Joe Louis, and it just, textbook, the way he was, the way he fought, the way he set up his opponents. There was just no one else like him during his era. And afterwards, I don't think that there'll ever be another one like him. He was a classy guy. He was a class act. There's no question about it. He also was a guy that was screwed over. by the sport in which he made a living. He did make a lot of money, but he was screwed. And when he died, he was, pretty much broke. He was a greeter at the casinos when he could stand. He did a little stint in professional wrestling. He did what he could. He ended up making money just being Joe Louis. People wanted to meet him. But to me, and you see some of the photos, I mean, if you go back, I mean, there's a shot where he was with a young Fidel Castro of Cuba before there was nobody was allowed to go there. And everybody wanted to be with him. At that time, heavyweight champions, that's how a lot of them made their money. A lot of them made their money just by being a world champion. And after their careers and earlier in the sport of boxing, they wouldn't make as many title defenses. Joe Louis obviously did, but they wouldn't make as many title defenses. They would travel around the country and just make money being the world heavyweight champion. Joe Louis made a living, so to speak, a modest living after he was a champion, after he retired, I should say, just because he was Joe Louis. And he did it out of necessity. But in any event, joining us right now is my man, Daxx Khan. Daxx Khan, what's up, brother?
Billy C, how are you?
I'm okay. I'm okay. Joe Louis, what's your thoughts?
Joe is that's a hard one, because there's so much about him that extends beyond boxing. And it's really more than what I think a lot of today's younger mindset can even handle, if that makes sense. Because exactly how important Joe Louis was to not just the country, but the world. How Joe Louis was screwed over so badly, how he affected people who were celebrities, who were politicians, other fighters. Joe Louis, believe it or not, and I know a lot of these younger fans will laugh or doubt or dismiss because, again, they really can't grasp that Joe Louis was bigger than Muhammad Ali. He was bigger than Sugar Ray Robinson, Mike Tyson, in one, because of everything surrounding him over so many years.
Dax, I started the show a little early today because I was so excited about. I had been mentioning, some of the stuff I've uncovered that I finally found. And I found when we did a Las Vegas stint, I was in Vegas for a week doing the show back in 2012, and Steve Lott, the late Steve Lott, was on the show, and he gave me the recording of the Max Schmeling fight, the second fight that I'm going to play here in a minute. But I want to make sure that I was waiting for you to come on. Because the first Max Schmeling fight, which took place in June of 1936 at Yankee Stadium, was Joe Louis's first loss, and he couldn't get it out of his mind. He would ultimately win the world title against Jim Braddock, but all he wanted was a rematch with Max Schmeling. And in 1938. And World War II was in its infancy. Hitler was trying to prove that they were a dominant race, and Max Schmeling, who really wasn't supportive of Hitler, he was married to a actress, a German actress, and that's a whole nother story. But they set up the rematch, and at the time, Max Schmeling was 52 wins, 7 losses, and 4 draws. It took place at Yankee Stadium on June 22nd, 1938. And I want to play the recording right now, okay? This is the actual radio broadcast of this fight, of the rematch that took place. Now, the backdrop here, Dax, is that this is like a the only thing that's missing is everyone chanting USA, USA. Okay. And you're going to hear Steve Lott here for a minute because we did this live and I wanted to include him on it. So let's hear the original radio broadcast of Joe Louis, Louis-Schmeling II. Well, we might as well listen to it right now. Now, we have the original. Now, this is the original radio broadcast, right?
The original radio broadcast around the United States and transmitted throughout the world in English speaking. And it's so wonderful because the announcer really was so good at Clem McCarthy at calling the shots. And you have to be really quick with that. Otherwise, you miss the moment and you're 30 seconds later, it's not the action, but we can listen and you'll hear it.
Yeah, now, just so everybody knows, this is the original radio broadcast. Steve is letting us play it, and the real producer has got it ready now. So check it out. Enjoy, people.
This is the feature attraction, 15 rounds for the World's Heavyweight Championship, weighing 193. Wearing purple trunks, outstanding contender for heavyweight honors, the former heavyweight title holder, Louis-Schmeling. Weighing 198 3/4, wearing black trunks, the famous Detroit Brown Bomber, world heavyweight champion, Joe Louis. Joe Louis in his car, passing and rubbing his feet in the rosin. Louis-Schmeling standing calmly, getting last word from Duck Casey, and the ready with the bell just about to ring. And there we are. And they got to the ring, went together with Arthur Gentleman, step around, and Joe Louis is in the center of the ring, Max going around. Joe Louis led quick with two straight lefts to the chin. Both of them white, but as the men clinch, Joe Louis tries to get over too hard left, and Max tries him up in the breakaway clean. On the far side of the ring now, Max with his back to the hook, and Louis hooks the left to Max's head quickly, and shoots over a hard right to Max's head. Louis, a left to Max's jaw, a right to his head. Max shoots a hard right to Louis. Louis for the old 1-2. The first, the left, and then the right. He's landed more blows in this one round than he landed in only 5 rounds of the other fight. And there, Louis-Schmeling caught him with his guard down and caught that right hand in Louis' jaw. But Louis is going away with the punch at the time. Now Max is backing away against the ropes. Louis is following him and watching for that chance. He is crowding and trailing. Schmeling is not sitting around very much. His face is already on this into a fast punch and at close range. Louis fights desperately to bring up a red left to the jaw and a right to the body. And coming out of that clinch, he got over a hard right and then stabbed Max with a good straight left jab. And Max backs away and missed the right. Louis then stopped him with 2 straight lefts to the face and brought over that hard right to the head. High on the temple. And Max right over the clinch and rope round. Is back against the ropes again. They're not too close to the ropes. Louis out and Louis missed with a left swing, but in close front of a hard right to the jaw. And again, a right to the body, a left up, a right to the head, a left to the head, a right. Schmeling is going down. But he held to his feet, down to the rope, looked to his corner in helplessness, and Schmeling is down. Schmeling is down. The count is 4. It's armies up, and Louis right and left to the head, a left to the jaw, a right to the head, and the gentleman is watching carefully. Louis measured him right to the body, a left up to the jaw, and Schmeling is down. The count is 5, 6, 7, 8. The men are in the ring. The fight is over on a technical knockout. Louis-Schmeling is beaten in 1 round. The first time that a World Heavyweight Championship ever changed hands in 1 round, in less than a round.
Man, great stuff. Interesting comment I just heard. Didn't Joe Louis have the title going into this fight?
Yes. For some reason, of all this, he got so excited he forgot that Joe Louis was
right,
and that the title did not change hands.
Right.
And but sometimes that happens. Even Cosell sometimes used to mess up like that too.
Man, that's great stuff. It's actually chilling.
It
is.
Yeah, and since I had watched the film about 1,000,000 times, as the announcer is calling the action, I see the frames going through my mind, the actual film, you know. And the one thing that made Joe so very, very special, a fight like this was huge at that time, and the huge knockout, the moment when the referee counts 10, Arthur Donovan, Joe just turns around and walks to his corner.
Great stuff. Great stuff. And I don't know. I think I lost Dax here. I don't have his video. Are you there, Dax?
Yeah, I'm here. You don't have
Yeah.
my video?
I don't. No. But in any event, great stuff right there. And I love hearing the radio announcer give him the old 1-2, and it just Joe Louis went and just viciously attacked Max Schmeling in this fight, and it was it sounded like a horse race the way the announcer was calling it. Did I got you back now, Dax?
Yeah, that was my fault. I was adjusting some wires and I hit something.
Well, in any event, what did you think of that?
That was great. I can imagine what it was like back then, sitting next to, as we spoke last week about Ray Robinson, and being limited television sets in homes and even limited radios where people would get together in groups. I can just imagine how many people sat around, considering even before World War II started, everybody knew what was brewing around the world in terms of Hitler's plans. So, and they knew that Max Schmeling was more or less Hitler's poster child, I guess you would say, for lack of a better expression, in terms of what the Aryan race should be like. And Joe Louis, the American, the anti Aryan race, the anti Hitler, and everybody just sitting around listening with bated breath, wondering what's going to happen, especially because Joe was knocked out in that first fight.
Yeah, and it went 13 or 15 rounds the first fight. This fight didn't go one round. Interesting thing, and I don't know how many people out there watching or listening know this, but Max Schmeling and Joe Louis formed a bond that lasted throughout, Joe Louis's life. Max Schmeling outlived Joe, but they respected each other immensely. And I believe they only saw each other one other time afterwards. But Max Schmeling became extremely wealthy outside of the ring. He invested in this thing called Coca-Cola and became the main Coca-Cola distributor, basically, for Europe. And obviously had buku dollars and would actually send Joe Louis money throughout the rest of his life, and paid for his funeral as well, which is pretty cool to consider, Dax, because the bond that sometimes people don't understand, especially in that era, that was formed inside of the ring. Now, here's two guys that are trying to literally knock each other unconscious, right? And they respected each other so much that it carried throughout their lifetime. I find that amazing. And although you do see some forms of that today, I don't think the impact was as much as it was for those two guys. What do you think?
No, it wasn't, especially because, one, Max Schmeling was so anti what was going on over in Europe, and he, after that first win, he truly despised Hitler, and he truly felt like he was being disrespected, as Hitler would call him his show horse. And the fact that Joe Louis was willing to step in the ring with him, and Joe Louis, despite everything else that was going on throughout the world and how the majority of people, especially in this country, looked at the German, Joe was always very respectful to him. And that meant a lot to Max Schmeling. And I do believe, of course, we have known, as you stated, other fighters such in more recent times, Mickey Ward and Arturo Gatti, you know, how they created a great bond after their rivalry. Add those with the other things that were going on in the world. Yeah, that was a special bond that, you know, you really can't really describe or, you know, even say, you know, what exactly held them so tight together, even though they were so far away and for so long. The only thing I do know is that when Joe Louis died and Max helped pay for his funeral, that a reporter had asked his wife, who was, as you stated, a European actress, about why did Max help pay for the funeral of Joe Louis, especially since the loss to and friendship with Joe put him in a position where Adolf Hitler considered exiling Max from Germany, to which her reply, I believe, was, Max said Joe Louis was a real friend and a friend would do nothing less. And I guess he said he regretted at times not doing more for Joe. And he was also a pallbearer at Joe Louis's funeral.
We're joined too by Alex Papali, who's surrounded by some great fighters in his own right now, if you see the camera shot. But Alex, I couldn't wait for you, man. I played the actual radio broadcast of Louis-Schmeling II. Dax and I just finished playing it. Chilling. I don't know if you had ever heard that before, but you know, the late great Steve Lott and I were in Vegas. I was doing a week there, and he let me rebroadcast that, and we just did it again. Thoughts on Joe Louis?
By far one of my favorites, and actually, as a kid, it was the first autobiography. His was the first autobiography I've ever read. And it's called Joe Louis, My Life. And I remember doing a term paper on it in high school. Yeah, I've been a huge fan. And quite honestly, I think that in terms of heavyweight champions, it's Joe Louis and Ali. I think Ali, of course, is the greatest of all time. He told us again and again. But I think I would rate Joe slightly better. In terms of skills, Ali, of course, he was supernatural. But I think Joe was all around the better fighter. He grew up very, very poor. His dad was mentally ill, and his mom moved him north in the Great Migration, where a lot of blacks moved north, fled the South, and he moved to Detroit. And, you know, as is typical for so many fighters, you know, very, very hard work, laborer, moved ice. And actually one of his first fights, I think he got knocked down 7 times, but he kept getting up. So this idea of guys who, you know, might start out a little discouraged. One of the inductees this year, of course, was Bernard Hopkins. His first pro fight he lost, Clinton Mitchell. You know, so that idea, you know, Joe to get knocked down 7 times and still think, I'm going to try this sport.
Yeah, well, that's never say never, right? Hey, Alex, of all people, you know how, you know, you and I try not to talk politics, but the truth of the matter is, you know, and like I said to Dax earlier and everybody watching, one of the things that irks me to this day is what our government did to Joe Louis about the tax money that he owed, and the money where it was from. It was from the World War II relief efforts, where he would fight exhibitions along with some other regular fights that he had in front of sold out crowds, where he donated his whole purse to the war relief, and the government hounded this poor guy to the day he died with their hands out, trying to get money. And of course, the interest, if anybody's ever owed the government money, and I know personally how they are, they hound you, and it's the penalties and interest. It just never goes away. What's your thoughts on that? Because I thought it was terrible, and this guy did a lot, not only doing the donation of his purse, but he did a lot for the sport. And I think for the times, this fight, this rematch with Max Schmeling alone was a United States unifying victory for him that goes well beyond the boxing ring. And of course, the desegregation movement that he was pretty much spearheaded for the military, for the United States military, which was still segregated during these fights. I mean, what's your thoughts that our own government pissed on this guy the way they did?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things.
Hey, get that cat out of the shot. We're not paying any royalties to the cat. Come on, man.
Well, that's I actually he passed away, but I had a cat named Max Schmeling. His name was Max, and I didn't want to change it, so I changed it to Max Schmeling. But I do think that it's extremely unfortunate, and it is to the point of it does seem almost parasitic, like they're taking advantage of him. Of if anybody deserved to get some sort of consideration worked out, you're right, for the amount of inspiration that he was able to do, to serve both during World War II and beyond. You would think that, and it also speaks to the idea that these fighters, a lot of them could certainly use a help outside of the ring. Financial assistance with accountants and stuff like that. I mean, that's the thing that's so sad about our sport, is that it's not like other sports where there is a league where, although you hear heartbreaking stories there about guys going broke too. I mean, one of the things about Joe is he was a huge spender. At the time, when he was in his prime, he was making like $400,000 a year in prize money. And the average American was making about $1,400 a year. And Joe was burning through it, spending. So
but that seems so common.
Oh yeah,
with athletes to this day.
He was genuinely a fault.
Well,
he would go out, hand out $100 bills.
I know. Well, the thing is that a lot of athletes today, Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield are the first two that come to mind. To lose all that money, it's what happens is their lifestyle doesn't change after the money stops coming in, and it drains them very quickly. You guys remember it's my favorite boxing movie, Requiem of a Heavyweight, and there's a scene at the end where Anthony Quinn, who was the character in the movie, after he screwed over and everything else, is forced to resort to putting on an Indian headdress and playing that character in professional wrestling. It was a direct connection to Joe Louis and the basically humiliation that a figure like Joe Louis, who was such a prominent figure, worldwide, not just in the sports, that they're forced to do. It's sort of like the zoo, making fun of the animal behind the cage, so to speak, behind the bars. What do you guys think of that, Dax? Start with you. I mean, because to me, that scene, as much as I love the movie and I love the character that Anthony Quinn played, I can't help but think of Joe Louis.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Number one, Joe Louis, he was, despite the fact that he was often insulted by various newspapers across the country, he was referred to as the Detroit Negro. The whole Bum of the Month Club, which I'm sure we'll go into, was more or less a form of racism where these were very good fighters, except they wanted them to knock Joe Louis out. And because they could not, that was an insult. That was a way of insulting them for not being able to knock out this Detroit Negro, this overrated, this big spender. But Joe Louis was totally different than Jack Johnson. He didn't flaunt things in people's faces. As Alex stated, he was generous to a fault. Joe Louis was the first active world champion to join the Army. And while he never saw battle, Louis traveled to exhibitions to boost morale. Joe Louis actually joined just a month after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. And on, I believe he had also just defended his title a month before that. And pretty much all of his winnings, as you stated, in 1941 were donated to the military efforts. It was, you know, he was discharged in 1945 with the rank of sergeant, but Louis did not make any money during those years that he was in the military. You know, all his time was spent as a patriot, as an idol, you know, to boost morale, to kind of bring the country together, to kind of get other countries to form a bond, so to speak. You know, Joe Louis is what I was talking about earlier on how important he was beyond boxing. And nobody ever told him that these donations were not tax deductible. Joe Louis also did not have really the best backers behind him. He had kind of questionable businessmen that, you know, more or less bankrolled him into the pro ranks. And on top of that, Joe Louis, while he was a patriot and he wasn't racist and he wasn't political, his fights with Max Schmeling that created a genuine friendship they both suffered for. Joe Louis never once, at least publicly, seemed to be bitter. And that speaks a lot about the type of guy he was. And it speaks a lot about the type of people who were around him over the years, including many celebrities, including our own government, weren't.
Dax, what's your thoughts on that scene, the connection with that scene in Requiem for a Heavyweight and the real Joe Louis?
Yeah, it was, you know, it was sad that Joe Louis had to resort to that. Joe Louis was lucky enough that he had a friend named Ash Resnick who he had met in the Army, who owned a casino that gave him a house to live in and a $50,000 a year salary, more or less to be a greeter at his casino. Except the debt creditors never stopped coming. You know, $50,000 even in the 60s, 70s was, you know, quite a bit of money. But Joe Louis, we often see him look more like he was shopping inside the Salvation Army, wearing mismatched cheap polyester suits. His health was failing. Everybody was an opportunist, including politicians, whether or not they were senators, whether or not they were governors, whether or not they were congressmen, whether or not they were businessmen. Everybody wanted to get a photo with Joe Louis. It was kind of like a nonstop weekend at the International Boxing Hall of Fame. And Joe Louis was more or less a monkey in a cage, if that makes sense. That he could not get out of.
It does make sense. And Alex, you know, that scene, I don't know if it made an impact on you the way it did to me, but it was extremely sad.
It sounds sad. I'm ashamed to say I have never seen that movie, Bill.
Are you effing kidding me?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Dax, should I just
hang up on me?
I mean, look at this.
That's my home.
What a fraud. What a fraud.
I know.
He's got Jack Johnson right behind him. He's never seen Requiem of a Heavyweight.
You know, I think it might even be saved on my TiVo. I just have.
Oh my God, that's even worse. That's yeah. Let me guess, you having a chance to watch it? Come on, Papali. You know, I mean, geez.
I'll do it for next week.
You better.
That idea that I mean,
Devo, didn't that go on? I think
Yeah,
I heard that with Web
I
TV.
know. I'm a dinosaur.
That's funny. Yeah.
Well, I tell you though, but anyway, I do think that, that's one of the sad things. I mean, just with Joe Louis's, twilight in wrestling, and the fact that that's part of what, he got severely damaged from, getting thrown around on the ring, and he broke a few ribs that I forget if it perforated a lung but I remember that. Him being like in rough shape for a long time after that. So, the fact that he had to resort to it was just because he had some cachet with his name, and that he was an ex-heavyweight champion. That he needed the money.
He needed the money. He needed the money because he was trying to pay the government off.
Right.
They hounded him at every corner.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. I mean, that is I don't know if the listeners are familiar with the children's book, The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein.
Oh, don't make me cry after that again.
Oh, I know. That is
you know what, Dax? He reads that and he makes us all cry, but he doesn't even watch the Requiem of Heaven.
I tell you, the thing about to me that book is sort of allegorical of a relationship with boxers. If you're a fan, if you really love this sport, because these guys give us and women give us everything. And when you see them at the Hall of Fame, some are more intact than others, and you have to really have no sense of empathy to not realize, wow, this sport shortens lives. And it is now. I'm not saying that if you go to a coal miners reunion, I'm sure there's a lot of people there with COPD. There's people who aren't there anymore because of black lung or something like that. And this is the trade that they signed on to. There might be somebody who is missing an eye from an injury down there in the mines. That's the same thing with boxing. And the thing that's about the Hall of Fame is we're not done with them. Just like in the Giving Tree, we still want more with the stumps that we see there. We want a picture with them. We want an autograph. And when you think about it, for them, it's beautiful again. Just like the tree, he's happy that the man sits on the stump.
Yeah, you know what though?
For 4 days they get to be a king again.
That it bothers me so much. I know what you're saying.
That's just it. That's the joyful participation in the sorrows of the.
I know. I had the conversation with Marlon 2 weeks ago. And I told him he was saying, "Why aren't you going?" And I told him, that's the reason, because. And it's not the kids. Dax and I had this conversation the last time we were up there together. And what really sucks is the autograph guys, the guys that are selling autographs, pictures, and stuff like that on the internet are pushing the kids away from getting the damn autograph, and they're making a buck on it. And here we are trying to build that audience again, But anyway, Dax, you mentioned about the bum of the month. I touched on it before you guys came on. I had to start early because I couldn't wait. But 27 successful title defenses, 22 coming by knockout from 1937 to 1950. And when you look at these guys, I mean, the tough ones, I'm not even going to include like the two-term Tony Galentos and the Jack Ropers, etc. But the guys, like Al McCoy and Johnny Paycheck and Arturo Godoy and, of course, Billy Conn and Buddy Bear and Abe Simon, which actually, which I just learned was considered the British heavyweight champion when he fought Joe Louis. But, I mean, all these guys, Jersey Joe, I mean, these guys were top guys. And to have them referred to as the Bum of the Month Club during that era, and compare it to today is mind-boggling because most of them would have had a belt, Dax.
Yeah, they were either a light heavyweight champion or they were champion like Godoy. He was the South American champion. Joe Louis also, going back to his generosity. When Joe Louis fought John Henry Lewis, who became a Hall of Famer himself, and this was the second Hall of Famer in a row that Joe Louis had defeated. The truth behind that fight was John Henry Lewis and Joe Louis were friends for a long time, and he had just successfully defended his light heavyweight title a few months earlier against Al Gainer. He was going blind, and he was going blind rapidly from blows to the head. Nothing to his eyes. It was a neurological problem. And Joe Louis, being such a good friend, knew that John Henry needed a big paycheck so he could retire. And he also knew that if he let John Henry Lewis stink by going any sort of rounds with him, he was still had it in him and his career could still go on. That would be most detrimental to John Henry Lewis than anything. So as a true friend, he insisted on that fight, and he made short work of John Henry Lewis because he knew if he knocked John Henry Lewis out in that first round, John Henry Lewis, due to discussions they had had together, would have come to terms with, all right, you know what, I can't anymore. And Joe Louis got him a huge payday, at least for, the time, and for John Henry Lewis's career. John Henry Lewis never fought again. It was a payday he deserved, and Joe Louis made sure that he finished him in a fashion, as I stated, where John Henry Lewis was under no false pretenses that he could continue on. And
speaking of John Henry Lewis, I just want to make.
I believe that there was a report one time that a reporter back in the dressing rooms trying to talk to Joe Louis was actually shoved out of the building because Joe Louis was in his dressing room and he was crying over what he had did.
Well, Rocky Marciano was crying over what he did to Joe Louis. But one thing I want to say before you give your thoughts on this, Alex, was John Henry Lewis was one of these fighters. Now, of course, I'm going to plug my book here. They mentioned that he was a descendant of Tom Molyneux. I never found that out. For every research that I did, that was not true. Because Tom Molyneux didn't have any kids. So how could he have a descendant? I mean, not any kids that he knew of, he did have several women. But Alex, your thoughts?
I think the thing about Joe Louis one of the things that just made him absolutely beloved and that made the Schmeling, especially the rematch, such a massive event was both a sociocultural sporting event was that and this was very important because if you think about it, Jack Blackburn, his trainer, had lived through the era of Jack Johnson. Blackburn was a lightweight boxer, a contemporary of Jack Johnson, who, of course, was the first black heavyweight champion. And because of his conduct, white America promoters, they just no black fighter got a shot at the heavyweight title until 1937, rather, when Lewis fought Jimmy Braddock. And that was one of the things that when Jack Blackburn was approached to train Joe Louis, he thought he was going to be looking at a white fighter. And he's like, yeah, bring this white boy over and I'll take a look at him. And they said, oh, no, he's a black guy. His name's Joe Louis. And they were like, are you kidding me? Because the idea that he'd go anywhere, he would face the same prejudice that every black fighter fought.
But
thing where he gave those specific rules.
Well,
it was a perfect match if you think about it, because he gave Joe the rules of never to be all the things that went wrong for Jack Johnson, in the sense of, went wrong in the terms of acceptance for white America, was never be photographed with a white woman, never be photographed or seen gloating over your opponent. And one of my favorite, let your right fist be the referee, because there's going to be a lot of fights that, you're not getting a decision. So knock these guys out.
Dax mentioned that about, we talked about that last week and again today. And I agree. It was a smart move for them to, basically coach Joe Louis, and it definitely helped the success. But being a huge Jack Johnson fan, it was a different world. And Jack Johnson, the thing about it, the way I read into Jack Johnson, and don't worry, boys and girls, we're going to do one on Jack Johnson too. But, this was a guy that hated Jim Crow America, hated having to take the back seat or not be able to drink out of the same water fountain or eat in the same diners as white people and all of this stuff. This was a guy that said F you to all of that and still, flaunted whatever he wanted to do. And to me, that's what I loved about Jack Johnson. He didn't care about what the public perceived him as. And yes, it hurt him, whereas Joe Louis benefited from not doing that. But I think that's what makes Jack Johnson, and especially Jack Johnson's version of his life. I mean, I've read everything on Jack Johnson, and he wrote an autobiography that actually was written in France, in French, and then they converted it. And he's like a superhero in that book. Like he was a spy. He was this. I don't know. Alex, did you ever read that?
Oh, yeah. He fights a shark.
He
fights and kills a shark.
Yeah, he's like a superhero in that. But anyway,
I think with Joe Louis, they managed him very well, because as he was coming up the pro ranks, he was very active, and he fought a lot of ex-champions, and that won him the favor of a lot of the crowd. I know my own family, my grandmother would always talk about how much her dad loved Joe Louis. This guy never really learned English, and somehow, Joe spoke to the Italians, and part of it was they saw him whack out Primo Carnera. And, he was an ex-champion. Of course, things didn't work out when he ran into the ex-champion Max Schmeling the first time. But if you read the autobiography, it's because Joe wasn't doing any training whatsoever. All he was doing was fooling around and playing golf.
It's funny you mentioned the golf, because he loved golf. I have photos of him reading books, how to fast track to being a pro in golf and all of this. A lot of athletes like that. But I want to bring up the Italian thing. Okay, Alex, you opened up the door. All right. I don't know if I ever sent you the article, but let me tell you something. I'll tell you why Italians are so close to African Americans. The Italians, the big migration, so to speak, European migration that everyone remembers, was in the early 1900s through the 30s, when a lot of Europeans, including Italians, came to the United States. But the first migration happened right after slavery was abolished here in the United States. And predominantly Italians came to this country, mostly Sicilians, back in the mid 1800s, and took the jobs that were vacated by the freed slaves who hightailed it out of town, specifically in the New Orleans area. Okay. And it got so bad, we all know how terrible Jim Crow America was, and with the lynchings and everything else. And the Italians were being lynched right next to the African Americans. And it got so bad that the United States and Italy was about to have a war. And the United States was a young country who just got out of a war, a civil war, and really wasn't fully healed from the revolution not that many years prior, and didn't want a war with Italy. So guess what they did? Go ahead, guess, people.
I don't know.
I can't believe I didn't send you this article, Alex. But
I think you did, but
oh, you never read that either.
It was,
Hey, I see how this guy. You see this guy?
it was behind a paywall.
Listen. They formed Columbus Day. They gave the United States recognized Columbus Day as a celebration for what the Italians contributed to America, and it prevented the war. And I never knew this. My grandparents came over here in the other migration in the early 1900s. I never knew it. It was appalling to hear how Italians were treated, and I can only imagine how African Americans feel. So yeah, I'm going to send it to you again. Maybe this time you'll read it. But that's why your grandmother loved Lewis. I'm just saying.
Wow.
Anyway.
Interesting about Joe Louis.
Damn you,
maybe you guys can, or Alex can clear this up, is when he won the title against
we send him. I don't know.
That he was not automatically recognized as the champion. It took the NBA and NYSAC different times to recognize him as the champion. There was, believe it or not, we always talk about and complain today that about sanctioned body politics, and they had them back then. And due to racism that, I was, from certain articles I read, was that the
hey guys, take it. I got away for a minute.
NBA really didn't want to recognize Joe Louis as champion, and neither did NYSAC, but there was no way not to recognize him as the heavyweight champion. Also at the time, Joe Louis, after losing his belt to Ezra Charles, he became the BBB of C champion by stopping Minnesota's Lee Savold, who was known as the battling bartender, later on faced Rocky Marciano. But Lee Savold had won his belt in England by defeating Bruce Woodcock in a rematch. And it was only the BBB of C who recognized Joe Louis as the heavyweight champion of the world at the time. And it was for only a short amount of time. I believe Savold and Louis fought somewhere around June or July, and then Marciano and Louis fought in, I believe it was October. But, Joe Louis had multiple reigns. And he had to overcome and deal with, several of these sanctioned bodies. Obviously, the BBFC in England, they were not quite as racist as this country was. Joe Louis, he was not always the and much of it had to do with, I believe, Alex, is because he didn't speak up. He could have spoke up, been a little bit more interactive with the public than Jack Johnson, without the Jack Johnson arrogance. And I don't think that would have hurt him. But, Joe Louis, as you guys already stated, was told to behave a certain way, which, Joe Louis did. And Joe Louis, between the Army hurting him, the layoff, and him not making that money while he was there, and Joe Louis donating his 1941 purses, the Army wanting the military, and not the army, not the military, but the government wanting taxes on that. As I stated, nobody explained anything to Joe Louis about this. I don't understand why. And I'll say something when Bill gets back about how he mentioned something of that picture of Joe Louis in Vegas later on in the wheelchair, and how that always stuck in his mind. And I'll compare that to something that's always stuck in my mind when I was younger, than some pictures of Joe Louis and some celebrities and a former fighter who was a world champion. And matter of fact, he managed 2-ton Tony Galento. Short story, that was Jack Dempsey, and he came to the gym and seen that Two-Ton Tony was not training for his fight with Joe Louis, and that actually kind of pissed Jack off. And Jack was in a silk suit, and so Jack gets out of his silk suit and he's wearing one of those full body pajamas that they used to wear back then, the underwear, whatever you call them. And they were silk too. And he gets in the ring and says, "Here, I'll show you how we did it back in my day." And he just beats the hell out of Two-Ton Tony Galento until Galento finally just told him, all right, I'll train.
Oh man. Wow.
But like I said, when Bill gets back, talk about the pitcher and what Ronald Reagan said.
Leave Ron out of this.
Well, I do think that one of the things with Joe Louis is that, especially later in life, I think much of his condition is as a result of fighting too long. And yeah, the financial woes are, compounded that, of course. But I do think that the relationship with Schmeling was fascinating because, yeah, they started out as rivals, and yeah, it's hard not to be sympathetic when you hear the whole Schmeling story, because there is actually a pretty decent movie about it too, a Showtime movie, I think, Joe and Max.
Yes, I remember seeing that.
Yeah, and one of the things with Schmeling was that he was dating one of Germany's best swimmers, and she, Adolf Hitler, took a shine to her. So there was a couple of times that, he had dinner with the Fuhrer, especially after beating Louis. And can you imagine where someone is openly flirting with your girlfriend and you have to keep your mouth shut? And then it's Hitler. So how uncomfortable would that be? But yes, they did become friends afterwards. I mean, Schmeling did fight as a paratrooper in the war, but then I believe after he left the service, he did hide Jews from the Nazis. So he was someone who, he was German, but he wasn't a Nazi, if you will. And him and Joe became friends later in life. And like you guys had already mentioned right when I came on, that he had helped pay for his funeral and was one of his pallbearers.
Yeah, matter of fact, he had denied several times going to dinner with Hitler at what I forget what they called it officially, but it was at Germany's version of the White House. But in terms of, like, say, now that Bill's back, Billy had mentioned about that picture of Joe Louis sitting in the wheelchair in Vegas that always stuck in your mind. And so I always start, since then, and when I knew about we were going to be doing this, I thought about me as a kid going downstairs, sneaking into the basement where my uncles and his friends would get together on Saturday nights, on Saturday afternoons, and watch old reel-to-reel fights on the basement walls, and they were really horrible in terms of quality. They must have been spliced together 200 times, and they had Jack Dempsey and Joe Louis among some of the other fights on there. And me being so young, I really had no concept of exactly how important these guys were. And just watching the reaction of the grown men, made me feel like, okay, yeah, these guys got to be something special. And also, as a kid growing up, in the 80s, Superman was Christopher Reeves. I wasn't obviously old enough to see George Reeves, and he was a man whose only weakness was kryptonite. And I remember seeing that news brief about Reeves being in an accident. While I knew he wasn't a superhero because I was in my my early 20s by then, when they showed that picture of him in the wheelchair that he controlled with his mouth, if you remember, I was kind of like a strange feeling in my chest, like, this is Superman. And even again, like I stated, I knew he wasn't, really Superman, but I just thought about growing up as a kid, this was Superman. And then when he died in 2004, I remember saying to a friend of mine how stupid I felt. And he had asked me why. And I said, because there was a time that I had really thought this guy was Superman. And when I seen him on other shows, or I seen him on interviews or in other movies, I always believed that he was in disguise. He didn't want his cape to be shown. It was all part of his whole other persona. And, whether or not you're a kid or you're growing up, we don't like to admit it, especially as adults, but we all have somebody we look up to, whether or not it's an athlete, whether or not it's an actor, whether or not it's a politician, so on and so forth. And when you see somebody like a Joe Louis or a Christopher Reeves, who were larger than life, and they're placed in that situation, it kind of just brings everything to reality that was never real before, if that kind of makes sense. You understood, but it just totally makes you look at your life and realize that whatever's going on, due to the fact that the person you looked up to has shown to be a ordinary person, no different than you, that you looked up to them, because especially in boxing being a one-on-one sport, we become more attached due to the fact that fighters either come from the same city, the same neighborhood. Some of our parents know their parents, they work together. I'm not saying that everybody wants to be a fighter, but you get this feeling that if they can do it, they can get out of here, and they can succeed. I can do it in whatever I want to do. So that's why they become an inspiration. In terms of Joe Louis, the most probably the most iconic set of pictures was in 1978, and Joe Louis was at some sort of gathering and get together at the casino that his friend owned. And at that event, you see a lot of rich people, a lot of celebrities, I shouldn't say celebrities, I should say, performers, and a lot of politicians, all trying to surround Joe Louis and get PR photos with him. Joe had a small smile on his face, but you can see the look in his eyes was more or less, there was no happiness. Joe Louis, that look, despite that smile, said, when will this be over? And it was evident that they were using Joe Louis to showcase their ego. Jack Dempsey, I think it was on his left. And there were a lot of people in front of him, and he was trying to kind of shield Joe Louis. And he had this look of anger in his eyes. And then there was a photo taken shortly after where Frank Sinatra is pushing Joe Louis out of the casino towards his car. Jack Dempsey's walking next to them, again on Joe Louis's left side. You got the event PR photographers, paparazzi, public people on the sidewalk, all trying to grab photos. Sinatra was clearly disgusted. Dempsey, if looks could kill, would. His fists were even balled up. And in the last photo is Louis being taken away to the home Ash Resnick, who owned the casino and gave him that job, had given him. The sidewalk was clearing up, people going in different directions. Some of those photos were cropped, and they were sold to different magazines, newspapers, and so on. But remaining was Jack Dempsey standing in the street looking at the car drive away as if a long-lost relative was leaving that he hadn't seen in years and was not sure if he'd ever see again. Frank Sinatra stood on the sidewalk, next to Sammy Davis Jr. His lips were pressed so tightly, and he had his fist balled up, and he looked ashamed of what took place. And Sammy Davis Jr. actually had tears in his eyes. We'll never know now what was really going through their minds or what took place that night. But, going from those expressions, what we've seen in those pictures inside the casino hotel, how many people used Joe Louis, important figures, other celebrities stalked outside. The paparazzi would, just like today, get massive amounts of money to get pictures of Joe Louis looking at his worst rather than his best. None of these people ever gave Joe Louis any of that money that they more or less leached off of his, not success, but his downfall and his time of hurt, rather than help Joe Louis at all. Frank Sinatra had actually paid for Joe Louis to fly on his personal jet to have heart surgery, with the absolute best cardiologist, best cardiac surgeon in the world at that point in time. When he died, I believe Frank Sinatra paid off all his debts, including with the government.
Frank Sinatra loved him, and he was at that famous photo that I hate. He was there as well,
and including what he owed the government. And he was quoted in a magazine as saying, "A man like Joe Louis doesn't owe anyone anything. It's the other way around, and I won't allow anyone to make themselves feel bigger than what they are by saying my friend Joe Louis was in their debt."
Yeah, well, that is, the impact that he made on people, especially entertainers, like you mentioned, Sammy Davis Jr. and, of course, my man Frank Sinatra. But a couple of things I just wanted to mention. He was only 37 years old when he lost to Rocky Marciano. An age today that we have a tendency to say, oh, heavyweights aren't in their prime till they're 35, So
Yeah, but remember, mileage.
So it's pretty crazy. And the one thing I want to clarify on the Hitler and Max Schmeling and his wife thing, Hitler wanted to literally put Max Schmeling and his wife in a concentration camp, okay, because of the way he would not carry Hitler's message. He refused. Wow. And the only reason they didn't was that the political ramifications that would have come, because just as much as Joe Louis was beloved here in the States, Max Schmeling was beloved in Germany. And all of Hitler's advisors, and for one of the times that he actually listened, he didn't. And her career was put on hold, and he wasn't able to make a nickel. They had to basically stay, home arrest, if what we call today, until years later. And like I said earlier, Max Schmeling did okay for himself in investing in this newfangled thing called Coca-Cola. And
what do we think of next?
I know, but amazing stuff with Joe Louis, and I know we could go on forever.
That's one of the things about it, is that if you think about it, 37 years old, but the mileage compared to today, the amount of fights he had.
But the other thing too, Alex, I don't mean to interrupt you, but it's the same thing that we talked about last week. The advancements in nutrition and training techniques and stuff also have to be credited to the longevity of athletes today. I mean, look, nobody loves the past fighters more than me, but I've finally, have to accept the fact. I mean, look, Joe Louis, average weight for his fights were 200 pounds. Rocky Marciano was 185, 188 pounds. These guys are not even heavyweights today. You know, Dax mentioned John Henry Lewis.
Cruiserweights.
Yeah, John Henry, not even, right? John Henry Lewis, light heavyweight. A lot of these guys would move up and down. Billy Conn, Tammy Morello, a lot of these guys, Bob Forster, a lot of these guys would move up and down from the light heavyweight to the heavyweight ranks. There was nothing wrong with it. And science has proved that a man, or I should say, a human being weighing, 175 pounds today can pack the similar power punch that a 265-pound man can, or woman, or whatever, can land. The difference today is they're 6'7", weighing 260 pounds, which is significant. But
right. I remember, because that was one of the things we saw, and people all wondered about that before Roy Jones moved up and fought John Ruiz. Is, will he have any effect on Ruiz? And he absolutely, 175-pound man can hurt and drop a 200+ pound man.
The speed, Alexander Usyk is a prime example recently.
Yeah.
Well, listen,
where it's a little harder is when you have somebody like a Tito who was real powerful at 147. It's, Tito did not have that power at like 168, 175, where he eventually did fight guys like Roy Jones.
No, wait a minute. I think it's different.
And even we saw it recently with Bivol and Canelo, where he didn't have the pop to really fade.
It's different when a guy is naturally 170 pounds and he moves up to 200 versus a guy that was natural at 150 pounds and moves up to 175. I think that's the issue. But listen, fellas, here's the thing. We're going to be doing our next show on Jack Johnson, okay? But before we close today, I wanted to give a shout out to a longtime listener who calls me frequently, and a lot of times has conversations with my voicemail. But his name is Augie from Riverhead, Long Island. You guys have heard me mention him a lot. His birthday was this past weekend. He turned 85 years old, and I want to give a shout out to Augie. And I appreciate everything. And he's pissed at the sport, which I can totally relate. And he says every show that he watches or listens to, all he's looking for is a prediction on Errol Spence versus Terence Crawford, who I think would win the fight and why. I know this is off of Joe Louis, but and he says every show that he watches or listens to, no one will give an exact prediction. They give you every other fact leading up to the potential fight. I have a prediction, and I don't know how you guys feel, but I know Errol Spence is bigger, and I know Errol Spence, has displayed a lot of talent and everything else. But I've been saying all along about Terence Crawford. Terence Crawford, in my mind, was 100% underrated. I'm not sure why people have the audacity to say that he hasn't fought anybody, because in my opinion, he has. He was the B side up until they finally said, wait a minute, let's switch him to the A side. He's got a mean streak. He's never once looked like he was ever in trouble. My prediction for this fight, and quite honestly, Errol Spence ducked Manny Pacquiao, and he shouldn't have. And Errol Spence really hasn't, huh?
He had a detached retina.
Yeah, all right. But my point is they could have made that fight even earlier. But as it turned out, he should have fought Manny because Manny lost. He was a finished fighter. But my opinion is Terence Crawford will beat Errol Spence. I don't care about the size. I think Errol Spence is a talented fighter, but he does not have the pedigree of Terence Crawford. So, Augie, my official prediction, should these two get in the ring officially, Terence Crawford's going to beat him. The only way that Errol Spence wins is if Errol Spence waits another 5 or 6 years till Terence Crawford's somebody alluded to earlier, Eddie Murphy in the famous barbershop scene. Terrence Crawford's only 37 years old, for God's sakes, when he's talking about Joe Louis fighting Rocky Marciano. But I think Terrence Crawford beats Spence. I really do. And like Dax said months ago, whenever we talked, Spence isn't the same fighter after the accident. He's not. He's not the same fighter. And I think he's waiting for a big payday. Should he step in the ring with Crawford, Crawford's going to beat him. What's your thoughts first, Alex?
I'm good. I'm glad, because this makes it interesting. I do think that Crawford is maybe the better fighter, but I think Spence is the bigger guy, and I think I think he's better at welterweight, and I favor Spence by the slightest margin, probably by decision. I can't wait for it to happen. But I'm glad we have differing opinions on it.
Yeah, well, you're dead to me now. Dax, what's your thoughts?
I think Terrence Crawford is actually more versatile because he's able to switch stances so often, so easily, and he has an added chip on his shoulder, and he is a little bit more aggressive than Errol Spence has shown to be even before the accident. So I would have to go with Crawford. So,
yeah, I mean, all kidding aside, Alex, Crawford's got that mean streak, something that a lot of fighters today lack. And I think it's so advantageous to a fighter to be able to flip that switch on and off. And Terrence Crawford does it amazingly well. I think it's going to be a great fight.
I can see it by the end of the year.
You think it's going to happen by the end of the year?
I think so. I think it will.
I don't know, man. Al Heyman's fighters just don't fight the real fights. I don't want to hear the name Charlo, either one of them. I actually had somebody email me say, oh, they're the best thing. No, they're not. They're not. But Crawford.
I think we're at a time where both fighters want it, and I think that's what's changed.
I don't know if Spence wants it. I think Spence is. I think Dax said this months ago. I think that there is something physically not 100% with Spence. And I think he's calculating the fights. He was nervous. Forget the retina. He was nervous about Pacquiao because Pacquiao was Pacquiao. We learned that Pacquiao was finished when he fought Ugas. But Crawford's not finished, even though he's older. I don't know. My money's going on Crawford.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought what he did to Ugas, to me, showed I didn't see any damage. I was very impressed with that. I thought he looked very, very sharp. I don't know. I'm really looking forward to it. Oh, one thing I did want to mention to you, was
stationary fighter.
Well, yeah. I mean, yes, true. I mean, he wasn't faced with Terrence Crawford, but he did what he should do with it.
Who did he beat so far? Let's be real. Who has Errol Spence beat like a top guy? Who?
Sean Porter.
Okay, Sean Porter. I'll give him that. I love Sean Porter. He's an aggressive guy, but he's not a refined boxer like Crawford.
Right. But I think he did. And
that was a close fight.
But I thought he
destroyed him.
I didn't think he destroyed him, but I thought he beat him pretty serious. What's the word? Convincingly. Okay. But one thing I wanted to mention, at the banquet, they were showing, when they introduced each Hall of Famer, each of the trilogy inductees, they showed like a little clip of highlights. And when they showed Holly Holmes' highlight, it was against Chevelle Halbach.
It should be, but anyway. All right, fellas. Well, listen, let's look forward to next week. Jack Johnson we'll talk about, and we'll go from there.
Sounds good.
All right, fellas. Thanks a lot. Everybody, don't forget to tune in, and we'll talk to you next time.
Ciao.
Ciao, baby.